everyone. Okay, welcome. So today we're going to actually start looking at data, and those of us who have had a lot of fun with creating apps so far, remember that sharing and visibility homework that I set you a few weeks ago, where we were creating records in Salesforce. And well, today we're going to look at an easier way to create records in Salesforce without sitting there and creating one record after another. We're going to do something slightly different. And as always, we're going to use Trailhead as our guide. Let me see, have I finished this? I have done this one before, but this is an example. This is the reason we're going to use Trailhead is because everything's all set up. We've got a CSV file that we can use for data import, and we can just work through it together. Now, data import, how do I make my own decisions about when to use certain tools? If I've only got, say, 5 or 6 records that I want to create, and I'm happy doing it with a quick action or just creating it directly, then, you know, maybe if I've got less than 10 records, I'll go and do it manually, because it can take longer to prepare the file for 10 records than it would be if you just did it yourself. Plus, you get the experience and you can understand firsthand whether it's a painful experience for your users or not. Let me talk to you about the tools that we have. So importing data into Salesforce, there are a few ways you can do it. And just to be very clear, in this module, we are talking about the kind of use cases where you are adding new data as a one-off task, where you're updating existing data in Salesforce as a one-off task, or even perhaps a regular task if you haven't got the infrastructure or you haven't got the budget and time to invest in setting up an integration, or if it doesn't happen regularly enough. You can use there are two main tools that we use for importing data, and your typical use case will be data migration. If you've got data that goes in once a week, you really should be looking at integration. And integration is how you just connect 2 systems together and you have data flowing between them. Data import uses the same APIs, but is not actually the same thing. So there's 2 main methods for importing data. One is the data import tool, and it lets you import data in common standard objects. So like your contacts, leads, accounts, there is some custom object stuff you can do. And the limit for that is up to 50,000 records. So what we say as a general rule is use the data import wizard if you're importing up to 50,000 records. Personally, I'm a fan of the data loader, but that's for the more advanced user. And it's purely down to personal preferences, because I've been using it for 12 years and I'm confident using it. There are also people out there who have built app exchange apps and desktop tools that will enable you to import data into Salesforce as well. The first one I ever used, I never used the data loader. I used a tool called Demand Tools, which is now owned by a company called Validity. And Demand Tools is pretty cool because it means you don't have to export data, twiddle about with it, and then re-import it as an update. You can run a script through Demand Tools to go and collect data that meets the criteria, and then you can actually transform it right there and then. But obviously that does come with a risk, because once you've changed it in Salesforce, there's no rolling back. So you want to take backups and you want to do it in a sandbox first. So data import accessible through Salesforce. You get into it by going to into your org and looking under the setup menu and finding the data import tool. I'm going to just open up my hands-on org, learn Salesforce with Gemma. The second tool that you can use is a desktop application called the Data Loader. This is my little friend here. This is Data Loader number 44, version 44, and it uses a user agent OAuth flow to log into Salesforce so that you can either insert, update, upsert, delete records, and you can also export records as well. Let me explain the difference. Insert means create. And you do all this from a spreadsheet, by the way. You do it all from a CSV file. So it means you've got to set up your CSV file, which is where most of the work comes from data migration, especially when you've got multiple sources of data, because you've got to find out which column in the old system matches the column in the field name in Salesforce, and you've got to copy and paste it all in correctly. And the amount of sorting errors I've seen in data migrations, it's incredible. So inserting new records. You load in a CSV file, you map the columns in the spreadsheet to the fields in Salesforce. You do it in one object at a time, and it will create the new records, and it will throw you back a CSV file with all the newly created record IDs in it. Great. Usually what I do is I then create a spreadsheet which is called useful lookups, and every success file I get that's relevant, I put into that spreadsheet, because I end up doing an awful lot of VLOOKUPs. Personally, I have trust issues. I like to go through, if I'm doing a data migration, I will always run checks, and I will VLOOKUP to the max in Excel. It's probably the most amount of time that I use Excel is when I'm uploading data into Salesforce. So I will always run, pressing that go button is a massive deal for me, a huge deal. I've got to make sure it's absolutely right. The updating, guess what that does? Updates existing records. So that also means that you need the record IDs. Upsert is a mixture of these two. And this is where if you create a text field, sometimes in Salesforce, it asks you to tick a box to say, is this an external identifier? That external identifier is an example of where, let's say you have a customer ID in SAP, and you're setting up Salesforce, and they've only ever had SAP, and they're going to switch the CRM side off of SAP and just have it for financials and things like that. What that means is you need a single identifier for each customer. So SAP will have an ID for your customer, and ideally you want it to be the same in Salesforce, because if you ever want to integrate with SAP, you need to know which account to send it to, right? Which customer account to send it to. So you would create, in that scenario, you would create a text field in Salesforce, you would make it unique, and then you would make it an external ID. Because then if you're using that as let's say you end up doing some uploads, let's say you're uploading invoice information into Salesforce, or any other kind of information where you want to tie it to the right customer, you can use that external ID as a way of telling Salesforce, here is a list of rows, here is the customer's unique identifier that is common across all the systems, which is an external ID. If you find a row for this external ID in your spreadsheet, then I want you to update Salesforce, and these are the columns that mapped over, etc., etc. I want you to overwrite the data in Salesforce that we have for that row, for wherever you find that ID. Now that can fail if you've got two records with the same ID, but you get that in the error sheet that comes out the other end. If the upsert function doesn't find that record, then it will create a new one, and it will put that external ID into the external ID field, because you will be mapping it in your next bit. Can anyone guess what the delete button does? Yeah, this is the danger zone, okay? So you want to be very, very careful here. And in order to do this, you need to have the record IDs, the 18-character Salesforce record IDs. And generally, that is all you need to delete those records. As with anything in Salesforce, if you are going to update any data at all, keep a close eye on what automations you've got. One of the most career-defining mistakes that people make is they forget to turn workflows off that are sending emails or are creating tasks. And I have very much done this before. I only did it once, never did it again. What you want to do before any data load is to actually have a plan. And that is quite often a client deliverable if you're in a client-facing area. In your plan, you would say, this is how I plan to migrate my data. I'm going to create these objects first. On this object, I'm aware of these automations. These automations can stay on. Those ones have to be switched off because the impact and the risk, and insert risk, insert pros and cons. And then you would also define what order you're going to load data into, because you can't load opportunities in until you've loaded accounts in. You shouldn't load contacts in until you've got accounts in. And you can't load opportunity products until you've got price book entries, and opportunities present in the system. So in that plan, you would document, you would sit and think carefully about what you're going to load and when, what are the volumes like, what are the risks, what is the impact, plan all of that out, get it signed off before you actually spend your week of data loading. Export is, pick an object and take data from it. Export all is export the entire database. So that's the stuff you can do with a data loader. With the import tool, you can do a lot less. You can just import records, you can map fields, and you can get a success file. And it works by running a job inside Salesforce. Obviously, the number of records that you can import depends on your permissions. I always feel quite confident with this one. I've done a lot of data loads, and I've always enjoyed doing them. And I still say now, even 12 years on, now that I don't really do much delivery anymore, I'm happy as a pig in shit if someone gives me a database and says migrate this. I can put my headphones on and I can just load. Can you only load or import records one object at a time? The short answer to that is yes, for sure. You can build applications that enable you to do 2 at a time, but they use code to do that. Typical example is the Nonprofit Success Pack, which is a special application that can be used by nonprofits. And that has a special tool for uploading donations. And someone's written some code that says if you take this one file that is like company name, donation amount, etc., then it will actually run a job that takes that data and splits it between accounts and opportunities. So yes, the short answer is you can only load or import one object at a time. And you can automate your data migrations. You can set up tools you can create rules in the tools that say, here is the source data, and then run one script and it runs the whole migration through. You can do that. But even then, in that script, it will just load or import one object at a time. Now, just a word on the terms that I use. When I talk about data loading a lot. Loading is, for me, it generally means insert new records. But I actually also use that term interchangeably to describe updating records. But I do try to be clear about what I'm talking about. So if I'm confusing you at any point, please feel free to shout. Excuse me just a second. I'm just going to top up my water. Another term that I've been known to use in the past with projects is to talk about data fixes. And data fixes are generally done when somebody's data is just in a bit of a mess and we need to run some updates or some upserts to that data, or we need to take data out of certain fields and move them into others. So that's another term that I use a lot. So what Trailhead says is use the data import wizard when you need to load less than 50,000 records. And you don't need the import process to be automated. And the objects that you need to import are actually supported by the wizard. Use the data loader to load 50,000 to 5 million records. If you need to load more than 5 million, the recommendation is that you work with a partner because we can run scripts that will use the bulk API and help it run through a bit quicker, or visit the App Exchange for a partner product. If you need to load data into an object that's not supported by the import wizard, then you can use the data loader. And if you want to schedule regular loads like nightly imports, then you can use the data loader for that as well. Now, it does use 2 types of API, and you can customize that in your settings. In your data loader, go to your settings up here, there's a couple of things you can configure. You can configure your batch size. So how many rows do we allow this to process at once? Do we want to use the bulk API? Yeah, yes. Enable serial mode for the bulk API. That means that for each of these batches of 200 that go through, you can run two sets of batches. You could run one batch followed by the next batch, followed by the next batch, followed by the next batch, instead of running them in parallel. You can set your time zone. You can use, we used to run everything through a proxy server at D&B, so we used to have to prefix all the proxy server details in here as well. That's for security of data in transit. And then you can actually change, there's settings in here as well that you can change. So insert null values is also an important one. If you're wanting to overwrite fields with nothing, then you have to tick that box first. Otherwise, it will just completely ignore the field and leave what's in there. Anyway, like, is everybody with me? Thank you. So, typical scenario: Cloud Kicks manufactures custom trainers or sneakers designed and personalized for their customers. Their sales superstars, Candice and Jose, are always eager to get fresh air and exercise, so they schedule a walking meeting with Linda, the company's Salesforce admin. They want Linda's help to bring their data into Salesforce. Because they have fewer than 50,000 records, they're going to use the data import wizard, aren't they? When she gets back to her desk after the walk, she preps the data for import. This is assuming that they've sent her the data to begin with and it's not in an absolute mess. So follow your steps before you start importing any data. 1, use your existing software to create an export file. That generally means Excel. Oh, sorry, no, this is actually a step before that. This is how you get the data out of where it is right now. Generally, your export file will tend to be a CSV file. Then you have to spend some time cleaning it up, which means updating to remove duplicates, good old pivot tables, deleting stuff you don't need, correcting spelling, other errors, enforcing naming conventions. So typical functions in Excel that you tend to use for data loads would be things like Vlookup, concatenate, proper, anything that you can use to kind of clean things up a little bit. Just see if I can find a sample data load file that you can look at that doesn't have any weird stuff in, sensitive stuff in there. There we go, production. Let me show you what sort of files you might be dealing with data loader as well. So this is a list of files, CSV files I've been using for imports and so on. So these are just extracts from Salesforce. These are errors that are spat out the other end by the data loader. And these are success files that are spat out at the other end by the data loader. Now, often you can tell if there's errors or not by looking at the size of file. Just gonna hide the sensitive information just to give you an idea of what you might see. So this is an error file. It's a CSV file. And in here, it will tell me my computer hates running Excel. Anyway, so in here, it will actually tell me why these records are errors, and why these records were not loaded, because I'm creating a duplicate. So I can more or less ignore those errors, but Salesforce actually tells me that information at the other end. So you get into a habit of getting your data ready and then checking it afterwards. Let me just find one load. Another thing that there's a few little tips and tricks that you can get out of this as well, which is around what do you load, and how do you name your files. I often name my files around what I'm going to do. This is, yeah, so I might have load contacts or delete records or delete accounts, or update account type, etc., etc. The other thing I do is I keep everything until I no longer need it, and then I delete it. I generally keep it about a year, because you never know when you're going to get asked what you did with stuff, you know, on certain days, and you often need to go back over your files just to check them. No, oh, org, here we go, data load. Oh, that's that file. Yeah, so then this is an example of a certs extract. So in our org, we track people's certifications, because we like to send them, as Ladies Be Architects, we like to send them little prizes to say well done. And you'll notice that this is just a simple data loader extract where I've created a custom object that represents certifications. And all I've done is just pull out the name and the ID, because I'm then going to upload a bunch of, I'm going to use this as a reference for another file where I've got a list of ladies who have achieved their architect certifications. I've got the name of the certification, and I've got the first name, last name, and contact ID of the contacts. So I've been doing Vlookup. What I tend to do is copy this. I do it a bit manually, but that's just because it gives me confidence to do it that way. I'm sure there are quicker ways to do it. And I just do a Vlookup on the name to pull back the ID into my input file, and then I can run it through the data loader. So that's just to give you an idea of the sorts of information you get from Salesforce with the data loader. Anyway, so you have to clean up your file, you have to get it ready to go in, you have to do some VLOOKUPs, make sure everything's consistent, especially with your pick list values. Watch your spelling as well, because if you remember when we created pick lists and it said, do you want to restrict the pick list values? That's where it's data import is where this is particularly relevant, because if you don't have that ticked, you could load any old text into those pick list fields using the data loader. It doesn't mean the user can select that pick list value, but it means that the data still shows up with that, with whatever you've loaded in, unless you restrict the pick list. Yes, so yeah, Kat. So Kat says, I love how in the image the dude has a prosthetic leg. Yes, we're all very inclusive here, and Salesforce is no exception. So we try and represent everybody. So step 3, compare your data fields with Salesforce fields you can import into, and check that your data will be mapped into the fields. We call this mapping, just field mapping. In the online help, there is a section that tells you about the mapping itself. So generally, what you can actually take as a rule is that the name of your column in your CSV file needs to map to a field. In some situations, you have to be really careful about what you map in. If you use record types, for example, we all know record types. We see them in Salesforce as a name. It always hits us in the guts when we try and use the data loader and set a record type, because you could put a column in your file that says the record type name and then get errors, because it doesn't want a name, it wants an ID, because record type is actually a different system table. So here's a neat little trick that I tend to do. I tend to export, there's a table called record types that is a system table that you can get at in the data loader, and I always export that. If I've got any org that's got record types in it and I'm about to do data, I always export that first and whack it straight into an Excel file that I then call useful lookups, because I know I'm going to need that in the future. And the final step is you might need to make some configuration changes in Salesforce to handle the imported data. Now, be careful about this, because actually you could be creating a lot of custom fields just for the sake of previous data. And if you're working on a digital transformation project, that's probably one of the worst things you can do, is just keep data for data's sake. And actually, if you live in a nation that is affected by data privacy laws like GDPR, you have to justify why you're keeping data if it's old. And I've sat in meetings where people have said, I've said to them, how many years worth of data do you want to bring over about customers, and how do you define what an active customer is? And how do you define what an active prospect is? And they just said to me, well, I want every single bit of customer data that we have to go into Salesforce. We can't do that anymore. And I think that that's a good thing. I think that personally, I believe that data in Salesforce needs to be relevant. And if you're loading in the purchase history of a customer that bought from you 25 years ago, how reliable is that data? How accurate is that data? Is it reflective and relevant of how your business is operating right now? These are the kind of conversations that you end up having about data loading. The second part is, often you can look at legacy data from another system and they send you like 200 fields and you're looking at that going, well, that field says the same thing as that field. Is that still the same thing? Oh, well, that field drives this. Okay, well, what about its matching field? Well, that one drives that. So you kind of looking at it and going, right, okay, I know that just needs to be, if I was going to put this in Salesforce, it would just be one field. So then my next question is, well, why does it need to be in Salesforce? What information and decision making will be driven by the data that's in this field? So actually preparing for a data migration can take weeks. If you're going to do it, if there's a lot of data, if there's a lot of sources, if there's data in disparate sources that needs to be brought together and then transformed, ready to go into Salesforce, most of the work is in the preparation and all the discussions around what you bring over. So I'm going to show you a little video about the cleansing experience. Let's have a look at this.
Cleaning up your data and preparing your import file is a time-consuming process, but there are some tools in Excel that you can use that will make it easier and faster. Watch all of these tips or move to the timestamp shown to see a particular tip.
Yeah, I should have said text to columns.
Sort and filter. Sort and filter makes it easy to locate duplicates. And filtering is a fast way to isolate certain groups of data, so you can apply naming conventions or locate blanks so you can identify incomplete records. Let's take a look. Here's our account import file. We're going to use sort to clean up dupes, and then filter to enforce a naming convention. We'll click into the column we want to sort by, and then click the sort and filter icon on the home ribbon. Looks like we have a dupe of 1 North Sierra, so we'll delete that.
Oh, manually?
And the first entry for ABC Labs looks like an incomplete dupe, so we'll delete that one too, and this duplicate of Acme, New York City. Now let's filter to isolate certain records so we can enforce a naming convention. We've decided to use the 2-letter abbreviation for all states. There are several variations for California in our file. We'll click the drop-down arrow and the sort and filter icon and choose filter. This adds drop-down arrows to each column. In the state column, we'll change from select all to showing just the variations for California. Now that I've isolated all these different values we've been using for California, I can change them all to CA. And we'll turn the filter off. Vlookup. Vlookup is a great tool to match Salesforce user IDs to the names of record owners, or to match account IDs to account names. In order to import this file of new accounts and have them assigned to the correct salespeople who own them, we'll need to have the user ID of each salesperson in the import account file. Currently, we just have their email. So we'll export a list of usernames and IDs using Data Loader. We're going to look up each email that is here in our account import file over here in the export of user information. And when there's a match, we want the corresponding ID to be returned. A few things to know about Vlookup before we get started. The matching value must be in the leftmost column of the lookup table. And that column must be sorted in ascending order. In the account file, we've added a column for the user ID. We want to look up the email in this table over here, and when there's a match, we want the function to return the value that is in the 4th column. We'll start in the first cell here. Click the function button and find Vlookup, and click OK. We'll click into the first field, Lookup Value. This first field is asking what value should I match with the lookup table. We want to match Cha. So we'll click that cell, and the cell address is written into the field. We'll click into the next field, Table Array. It's asking for the location of the lookup table. So we'll highlight the table. And the address for that range of cells is written into the field. Next, we'll click into the field, Column Index Number. This is the column of information we want returned once the lookup value is matched in the lookup table. We want the fourth column, User ID, to be returned. So we'll type 4. The last field is asking if we want an exact match, which we do. So we'll type in false. Now I can copy this formula down to the other cells and save. It's very important to note that the cell addresses for the table array must be absolute and not relative values. You're going to need to match account IDs to contacts and opportunities, and you're going to need to identify the owners of each account, contact, and opportunity by their Salesforce ID. So mastering Vlookup is essential. Paste special as values. Cells can contain formulas, even though they display the value. These formulas are dependent on the cells they reference. If you delete any cells that are used in the formula, you'll get an error. Paste special as values allows you to convert formulas to their values. Let's take a look at this in our account import file. This is our account import file, and we just created a Vlookup to match the created by column with the user ID. We'll use paste special to convert this formula to its value. In the formula bar, we can see that the cells hold formulas. We need to delete the account owner column because data loader import files should only contain columns that will be used in the import. And we're using user ID, not account owner, to designate the owner of each account. But when we delete the account owner column, the lookup formulas display an error. Let's convert the formulas to values so we can delete columns we no longer need. We'll select the formulas, right-click, and choose Copy. Right-click again and choose Paste Special as values. You can see in the formula bar that the cells have been converted to values. And now I can delete the account owner column. Format cells. Excel drops leading zeros, but the Format Cells feature is a way to get around this. So you can enter data that begins with zeros, such as zip codes and phone numbers. This is our contact import file. We've got zip codes where the leading zeros were dropped. We'll use Format Cells to reinstate the zeros. We'll select the column we want to format. We'll right-click and select Format Cells. On the Number tab, we'll click Special and choose Zip Code. And that will fix the leading zero problems.
It's just buffering, darling. Don't click anything, please, Molly. Sorry, everybody. It seems to be hanging for a second.
Find and replace.
There you go.
Find and replace is a workhorse for cleaning up.
So I use find and replace a lot.
Data. You can use it to replace one value with another.
No, I'm not.
Yes, you are.
Sorry, everybody. I think my bandwidth. I'm going to switch my camera off just briefly.
They're all muted. You're muted.
That's because I'm playing video and sharing my screen at the same time. Yeah.
And you can also use it to remove things like empty spaces.
Sorry, everybody. Thank you for your patience. Well, it just...
Let's use it to fix up some phone numbers. This is our contact import file.
That's a shame. It's a really good video.
Not really good if it keeps doing
We're going to use find and replace to clean up phone number data.
Okay, everybody, sorry, my bandwidth seems to be playing up a little bit at the moment. So let me pause that and let it buffer. Does anyone have any questions so far about what we've looked at? Can people still see me, hear me? Sorry, can people still hear me and see my screen? Let me know in the chat. Okay, thank you, Natasha. So I thought I wasn't sure. I think I'd lost you. So I'll come back and play the rest of that shortly while it's buffering. So as you can see from that video, there are quite a few functions in Excel that you'll need to use, but you will find that the more practice you get, and certainly if you've done time as an administrator, you get a lot more practice in terms of loading data, and you start to get yourself into like a habit. So for me, all of this doesn't take that long because I filter a lot. I tend to filter and then do find and replace, or filter and then paste down. I also have fallen foul of the pasting down. You know how in the video the gentleman was actually copying his formulas down by clicking in the bottom right hand corner of the cell. Now I've fallen foul of that a few times because it has overwritten data that if I've got filters on, it has overwritten data that is between each row because it's filtered, and that's caused some issues before. Also, I didn't like how in that video, what I would say is be careful about how you sort as well. If you've got any blank columns with no headings, by the way, my daughter's typing to you all. If you've got any blank columns in your data set with no headings and then you go and sort, then you will end up then you can end up with incorrectly sorted data, and therefore it can affect your accuracy quite significantly. Molly. So how do we get to, so once we've got our files all sorted, how do we actually get to the data import wizard? Molly, just a moment, please. Thank you. So as I said before, you can get to the importer by going into your Salesforce org. Molly.
Good. What's the matter?
It is recording, by the way, just letting you know. So you'll be immortalized forever as a cheeky 8-year-old. So you come in and just start typing data import, and then you'll get data import wizard.
Can I spray you now?
Not with that. Okay.
Do I get the mouse back now?
No. So when you go into the import wizard, you're actually looking at a separate kind of system here that is exposed into Salesforce, Salesforce being the platform. The first thing that you'll see is you will see a status, you will see the objects, you will see records that are created, updated, failed, start date, time, processing time, etc., which becomes important, especially when you're dealing with large volumes of data. So again, it tells you to make sure that you clean up your data import file, make sure your field names match Salesforce names. And the reason why is because that's a big time saver. The other great tip that was given in that video, Molly, I'm serious, thank you. The other great tip that was given in that video was to make sure that all the columns that are in your file are, that the only columns that are in that file, in your import file, are the ones that you need to load data for. Molly, if you want to sit in colour, I'm more than happy for you to do that.
No, I want to draw a moustache on myself.
Okay, fine. So that's the reason. So we just need to make sure that that is there, just that all of your columns are relevant, so that you don't so that you don't end up confusing yourself, because it can be very easy to tie yourself up in knots when you're loading data. That doesn't like me. The other thing that you'll need to do if you're gonna import data using the data loader, you're going to need your username and password. Sometimes you might also need your security token. Rarely, but do. And that's why, you know, for the projects that I set you for homework this week, you will need to make sure that you have your username and password for your Trailhead playground. And Salesforce has actually given you a way of doing that directly inside your Trailhead playground as well. Right, let's just see. Yeah, that video has given up the ghost, I think. So it's going to take a long time to buffer. So if you, do make sure you watch it outside of this session. So in order to do this, thanks, Molly, love you. So in order to do this, okay, we got a nice import job to do in a minute. So to start the wizard, you go into the data import wizard and you choose the data that you want to import. So we are in and we hit launch wizard. And as you can see here, you have a list of objects that you can load data into. Remember, this is quite limited. Some objects you can't load data into and you need to use the data loader. Generally, accounts and contacts you can load together. That's probably the only exception, actually, Jeremy, to your earlier question about do you import one at a time. In the data import wizard, you can import accounts and contacts in one file, but that's the only isolated, standardized use case for that. You can also load in leads. Nobody ever loads in solutions anymore. Campaign members as well you can do. Campaign members is like adding a contact or a lead to a campaign. Here are the custom objects that you can load into. So remember we were creating energy audits earlier on in the course. Oh, still running.
I paused it.
And then you get to choose whether you want to add new, update existing, or do an upsert. So add new and update existing. So in the way this maps to data loader is you've got insert, update, upsert. So if we want to add new records, we then have to there's a couple of things that we can answer here. Do we want to set off our workflow rules and process builders? So this is a nice, easy way of saying yes or no, but it will do everything. So if you wanted to switch off certain processes, certain flows, certain bits of code, then you have to do that one by one. Whereas this is kind of this is a very binary, do we run them yes or no? And it will run everything or it won't run anything. What that also means is if you, let's say if you have processes running that are automatically updating fields in Salesforce for data quality reasons, you might want to leave those on. Or you might want to replicate what they do in your source file. So make sure that that source file has everything you want it to say for each row.
Goo goo gaga.
Goo goo gaga. So then you say which user field represents a record owner. So is it a name? Is it an external ID? So like an email address or something? Or is it a Salesforce user ID? Do you want to match by name for contacts or accounts? In terms of identifying whether that is an existing record or not? And then you can actually say which account field in your file do you want to match against to set the account lookup field. Do you want it to be an ID or a name? So just a few additional features that make it easier for people. Please don't draw on yourself. You've had a bath. Molly, no.
I'm pretending.
Good. Then you have your update existing, so you can match by name. Again, for users and accounts, and you can choose whether you trigger off your automations. And then you've got upsert as well. And upsert again is where it says which one is your external ID. And then finally, you can drag your CSV file here, or you can search for it on your computer. And you've got a couple of options. You can search, you can in a CSV file, you tend to delimit your data by comma, but in here it will also accept a tab delimited format. And then you click File and then just browse to find the right file. Don't draw on me, please. Thank you. The thing that they introduced a couple of years ago, which I thought was kind of funny, was you've got this getting closer, getting closer, getting closer kind of progress bar across the top. It was kind of cute. So that's what you will tend to see. The next step, and we'll see that together in just a moment, is that you need to map your data fields to Salesforce data fields. So it will try and map them as many as possible And that's why you need to have your column names matching as best you can. Your column names really should just match your field labels in order to make sure that they get mapped correctly by Salesforce, by the data import wizard by itself. You can actually, there's a specific thing for accounts and contacts. You can actually save data from unmapped fields into a general notes field for accounts and contacts as well. So that's if you wanted to, let's say you've got legacy data that you think might still be useful but doesn't map to any agreed fields in your data model for Salesforce. You can just still keep that data but put it in a field called note. And then you can actually change. So obviously Salesforce will perform automatic mappings for you, but you can override them yourself because it doesn't always get them right. Check everything before you start your import. Start import is the red button equivalent. Do not press the red button until you're happy that it's going to do everything you want it to do. That's beautiful, Molly. Well done.
Spawn point.
It's a spawn point. Okay.
My own Roblox spawn point.
Wonderful. So couple more bits and bobs and a few gotchas. If you are importing, so remember that piece about restricted and unrestricted pick lists that I mentioned earlier? This piece of advice talks about you being able to just shoehorn some data that doesn't match your pick list into Salesforce. All it does is put the data in the field. The users can't then select it. It doesn't change the metadata. It just changes the data. And then the metadata is just as it always was before. So they'll still get the same pick list values that you've put into that field, but they won't see the option of what's showing in the data for that field. If it's, yeah. Then you have your multi-select pick lists. These are like, you know, the opinion is very divided about multi-select pick lists. Sometimes they're needed, other times they're not. They can distort your data and make it tough to report because you have to separate your values by a semicolon. But what it also means is that it's very much the data that goes in is at the mercy of which order which options the user clicked first. So you could have a multi-select pick list called lead source, and you can have trade show and network. If you've got someone who puts trade show and network, who clicks trade show, then network, and puts them into your multi-select pick list, the data will be trade show, semicolon, network. If the next person puts network first and then trade show, the data that will be shown is network, semicolon, trade show. That makes two different report groupings in a report. So you end up having to bucket those together and it can just get really messy. So generally, you need to have a compelling reason to choose multi-select pick lists is all I'm saying. Checkboxes, you can use true or false, or you can use 1 or 0. For default values, if you don't map the field in the import wizard, the default value is what's going to go in that field. So let's say you don't map lead source and you're loading in a bunch of leads and you forget to put a lead source column in there, and then in your pick list in Salesforce behind in backstage area, you've said that the default value is network. All of those new leads will be loaded in with the lead source of network. So just be conscious of that. Date time fields, you need to watch your locale. If you're based in the States and your computer is based in the States and you're loading data, someone from the UK sends you a spreadsheet and you need to load that in, be aware that the dates will probably be in the UK format. So you're going to have to set your locale correctly to make sure that your dates don't get all messed up when you load them in. And vice versa. Formula field, you can't put any data into a formula field because it is derived by the inputs of 2 other fields, or 2 or 3 other fields, whatever, however you've built it. Validation rules, you will be hit by validation rules when you load your data in. So if your data is wrong, you will see the validation rule error message showing up in your errors file that comes out the other end. So either make sure your data's right to begin with, which is the preferred option, or consider deactivating your validation rules just to get it in and then switch it back on afterwards, which is in reality what happens. So shall we have a little go at loading some data into our Trailhead playgrounds? There is a CSV file. I'm gonna put a link to this Trailhead module in the chat, and if you scroll to the bottom to the challenge, you'll be able to load in. You'll be able to download the CSV file for this exercise. Jeremy said, if you disable some of those rules, when you re-enable them, will they check to make sure all the data is compliant, like a constraint that can or cannot be enabled? If they're off, and the data can go in. Once the rules are back on, it won't go retrospectively over the data and go, you're wrong. Remember that validation rules fire when a record is edited or created, and it meets the criteria of the validation rule. So what will happen is the next time you can import non-compliant data, yes, many people do, but what will happen is next time a user tries to change that record, that record will fall foul of the validation rule. So some use cases might be when, and I've sent data back to clients many times when they've sent me stuff, and I've sent back and said, can you give me what the value should be in this field? And they say, well, we don't know. Just load it in as you need to update this. Switch the validation rule on, so that the next time when the user starts playing with that, because they're in the best position to know that information, then the system can prompt them to fill it in.
Oh, I didn't miss my best.
Okay, so let's download this CSV file. Right click and select Save Link As. Contacts to import. Why is it coming as okay, it's a text file. So I'll leave it in my downloads. Okay, then it says, now why it's a text field, I don't know. Okay, yeah, right, okay. So I'm going to do that. The next thing I'm going to do is open up Excel, which is going to cane my system resources, but it's fine. And then I'm going to use Excel to actually open up that text file. Do it over here. So I'm going to browse, new, blank workbook, and create. And then I'm just going to go to File, Open. You learn about Excel, Molly? Come learn about Excel. It's so thrilling. And I'm going to find my new file,
tech lady.
My contacts to import text file. Double click. And you will see you get the option to show whether your text file is delimited or not. So delimited means separated by a comma or a tab to separate each field. Fixed width is if you've got everything in a consistent. Do you know where I've used fixed width? When I've actually when I've exported data as a text file from a SQL query, and all the columns are laid out and there's great big gaps in between, and then I've been able to use fixed width where I can just move the lines around. So I'm going to hit next, and I'm going to make sure that I select comma. Notice how when I've selected comma, all of those fields are now separate, all of those rows are now separated. Another typical thing that I've tended to use is text to columns, especially because of the way that Salesforce structures address data. A lot of data that I've had to fix for people doesn't come in the same format as Salesforce needs, with like street, city, state and province, zip code and country code. So I've had to kind of spit that out myself using text to columns. So I hit next, and this is where I can choose, are there any fields that I want to change formats for, or I want to like skip for importing. I'm not going to do anything here, and I'm going to hit finish. And for some reason, it's opened up a completely different spreadsheet. Thank you. Right, so here's my contacts to import. It's now a lovely, still a text file. I've not saved it yet. What I need to do next is actually save it as a CSV file. So I go to click in here, and then I go to File and Save As. And notice it's still a text file. I'm going to change the format to comma separated values. And I'm just going to save it in my downloads folder. Okay, hope you're all following along. This is the fun part. Then I'm just going to close it because I've had situations in the past where it's kicked off at me because I had the file open. Okay, let's just check. Use name for matching contact records. Map all fields in the CSV file to the appropriate contact fields. So map cell to mobile. Do not modify or delete the imported data until you have successfully verified the challenge. So we launch our playground. And we go backstage. So we click Setup. And we find the data import wizard. So I start typing data. Data IM, data import wizard. Okay. So what do we do first? We go to launch the wizard. And we click accounts and contacts. We click, let's just check what the instructions say, import, yeah. And we're going to use name to match contact records. So we're going to add new records. We're going to match contact by name. Let's just check anything else. Okay. So once you've done that, all you need to do next, once you set match by contact by name, you can either drag your CSV file here or you can go and upload it. So I'm just going to click CSV and I'm going to browse for it. And choose file. Go to downloads. And there's my CSV file. Okay, so that's all cocked and ready. Let's just double check. We've selected accounts and contacts. We've matched the contact by name. We have selected the CSV file that we're going to use to upload. Do I want to assign them to a campaign? No, not in this case, but you can. And then hit next. Then we get to this fun part, which is the field mapping. So it's actually reading the data that you've got in your file. And first thing I've seen is a typo on the email address. Woohoo! Anyway, so here is the header from the CSV file. So you've got fname, lname, cell, email, salutation, title. And you'll notice it's actually Salesforce has managed to map these three fields here. So email, salutation, and title. It's figured out which fields it belongs to. We've got to map these directly. If the CSV file said first name instead of fname, it would actually map automatically. So we click map. And then we can just choose the field that we want to map it to. And because we're working on accounts and contacts, you get you actually get a set of all the fields for both those objects. So we're just going to, let me see what else you can do here. Now this is the section about notes. So remember those fields where you can't see a home for them? You can actually choose to map it to a note instead, which makes the job a bit quicker. So this is first name. So I'm going to start typing in first name. And up comes contact first name. So we just click that. And then I'm going to have to zoom in, I'm afraid, because zoom out, I'm afraid, because it hides if I don't. And then we just click map. And now you can see that the first name is mapped to the first name. Be careful and check again, even if you think and you're confident that it's all there. Do not hit start import until you're very confident that you have mapped everything correctly.
Mommy, there's a new black cat. There's a black cat in the garden. It's in one of ours.
Okay, I'll come and help in a bit. Got another 25 minutes, baby. Okay. Thank you for your patience. So then we hit map again, and we're going to map our last name. So we go last name. Comes contact last name, and we hit map. And finally, we want to map cell to mobile. So we go to map, start typing in mobile, and map. Now I'm going to go through line by line. Am I confident that everything's mapped correctly? So first name maps to F name, last name maps to L name, mobile maps to cell, email maps to email, salutation to salutation, and title to title. And then here are some examples of what sorts of information you would see. I'm confident that that is mapped correctly, and I'm almost done. So I'm going to click next. And now it's going to give me a quick overview of what's going to happen next. So it's like the last chance. I love how it still says great job, even though I've not started the import yet. But it just gives you one last chance to double check what you're about to do. So you've got 6 mapped fields. It's mapping to accounts and contacts. You're going to add new records, and you're going to use the contacts to import CSV. When you're ready, hit the button. Congratulations, it's started. Great. So you can go and look at your bulk data load job for the import status. It will also email you when it's successfully finished running. I'm going to hit OK. And then it takes me straight to the bulk data load jobs. And you can see that Salesforce has created a job. And inside that job is a batch. And it's a batch of 20 records. And it will tell you what time, what was the batch ID, what was the request that was made to the Salesforce server, how long did it take to process, what time did it start, what time did it end, and what's the current status. So we can say that by looking at this, it has successfully completed, and we can view the result by clicking on View Result. And it will download a CSV file that contains the results of the import. So moving this along. So what we see is here is the newly created record ID for all 20 records. We can see that the job ran successfully. These records were created and there were no errors. If I'm bulk loading in all my accounts and I know I'm going to then be loading in opportunities afterwards, I will tend to take this result file and save it in my useful lookups as a tab that says accounts. Or I will use the data loader and export all that data so that I can map it to an account name, for example. Any questions on that? Okay, so that's the most simple way to import data. Let's have a look and check the challenge. And while that's running, I'll just top up my water. Great. One other thing to do before you go and celebrate is to actually take a look at the data and have a look at what went in. You all right?
Yeah, that was a cat that went.
Okay. So you can look at your new this week. If you go into Salesforce and look under contacts, you can go to new this week, not new last week. And you should see your 20 contacts that you've just uploaded. There we go. And here they all are with all of their email addresses. And one of the things that you can do with much larger batches is actually keep refreshing this while the data load is running. You can keep refreshing it and watch the list get longer. Like, I'm very nerdy and I enjoyed watching that. Okay, so that's the first part of the challenge. We've got 20 minutes left. What are you doing, Moz? So the next thing we have to do is go to export data. I think on Wednesday we'll play with the data loader. That will be fun. And there'll be a couple of projects for you to do as well. So exporting data is where you actually take data out of Salesforce. Now, this is something that you have to have permission to do through profiles. Typically, if you are in a sales environment, well, generally actually for data security, if you've got somebody who's leaving or has handed in their notice, good practice would be to take the export data permission off their profile, or move them onto a profile which is a leavers profile that prevents them from exporting reports, prevents them from importing data, exporting data, and generally sabotaging, especially if you know that they're disgruntled. Just a little tip there. So data export, you can use the data export wizard in Salesforce to do that. And it's an in-browser wizard that you can get to through the setup menu, just like the import wizard. And you can export data manually once every 7 days for weekly export, or every 29 days for monthly export. You can also export data automatically. And this is a way of backing up your Salesforce instance, and it should be an integral part of any disaster recovery solution that that your company has, basically. You'd be surprised how few people do backups. It's insane. Loads of people don't. I mean, myself included, we haven't done any backups yet. Actually, that's not true. I did run the weekly data export last week. One of my jobs as an admin used to be to run this function. I also had to use the setup audit trail to make sure that other people were not running this function. So under data export, you can do in here is schedule. You can either export everything now, or you can schedule an export. If I hit export now, it will ask me whether I want to export attachments as well as objects, and it will ask me if I just want to export all data or certain objects. So if I want to export leads, then I can. Jeremy asks, can you export the metadata as well? No, not using this tool. This tool is purely about data. If you want to export metadata that defines the org, then you'll need to log into a tool like VS Code, where you can pull down the metadata and make a local copy of it on your machine. Generally, that's what people tend to do when they use Git when they use any kind of version control CI/CD tool. You can actually pull down the metadata. You can make changes to it in your own local copy or a scratch org, and then you can update that metadata into a version control system like Git, and then use another tool to automatically deploy it into Salesforce. For this, I can obviously this is talking about a monthly export service, so I can only export now once a month, and then it asks you, what do you want to do about this stuff? Do you want to include any images, documents, and attachments? What objects do you want to export? And it gives you all the system objects as well, not just the objects that you have created. You can see there's a whole bunch of other objects in here. Or you can actually choose to schedule it and have it automatically run once a week, and it will email you when it's available. And basically what you get is a whole bunch of zip files to download. And the more data you have in your org, the more zip files you will have. And then you can download and install those. What I used to have to do was to put them onto CDs. I used to have to, every week, put it onto a CD and then send it down to IT, and they put it in the fireproof safe with all the other backups. So that's that data export. The other way you can export data is using the data loader, where you export object by object, and you can either operate it through the command line if you want to automate it, or use APIs, or you can actually use the data loader user interface to export that information. Now, I use export a lot. I've just shown you how to do all of that. So I think there's a quiz actually, and in the quiz, because I've done it already, that means I have to go incognito to run the quiz with you. So in order to do this, okay, so quiz number one. Question number one, the data export wizard, A, can be operated through command line, B, must be installed separately, C, must be installed by an actual wizard, or D, is accessible through the setup menu. I'm expecting Kat to say C. Okay, D. Any others? Okay. Question number two, to export data manually using the data export wizard, A, from setup, open data export and select export now. B, install the data loader client application. C, grow a long beard and find a magical staff. D, open the data loader bin file in a command prompt and run the extract all command. So this is to export manually using data export wizard. Okay. Question number three, the schedule export option can be scheduled at the following intervals: A, daily, B, every other day, C, on Thursdays and twice on Tuesdays, D, yearly, or E, weekly or monthly. Okay, good job, everyone. Let's check your challenge. Woohoo, fantastic. So hopefully you've all got confetti and you've passed this one. So for today, we have covered importing and exporting. And then for the next session, I think we will have a go at using the data loader. Now, in order to do that, you will need to download the data loader onto your machine. And it works for both Windows machines and Macs. But what you will also need to do is make sure that you have the username and password for your Trailhead Playground so that you can then log in to Salesforce through the back door, if you like, via your data loader. So if you're stuck on how to do that, I'll just spend a few minutes doing that with you now so that you're ready for Wednesday. And I will set some homework around, there's a couple of projects around data loading that I will put into the homework session for you to have a look at for this week. So to reset your password, go to setup in your org. Sorry, for tomorrow. Yes, tomorrow, not, oh my God. Yes, apologies. I do mean tomorrow. So tomorrow we will be doing data loader. Thanks, Natasha. I keep losing the days. So we're going to reset password. So you go to users and users. Because when you first provision your Trailhead org, it doesn't give you a password. So you have to go and reset it to get one. So users, don't go into your user, just tick the box next to your username and hit reset password. Click OK, and then you will receive an email which has the password reset in it. I'm just going to do that because it's hooked up to my personal email. So I'm going to open that in a different screen, try and find it. Come on. So my laptop's about to take off because of all the stuff I'm doing. Right. So I've just clicked the link in the email. I'm bringing it back into my screen. So then you get to kind of choose a password. So I'm going to use LastPass, which you can do if you want to. And I need to do it on a different screen. And don't worry, it's not the one you've just seen because it's just changed. Then you set your password. One thing that is going to be quite important is make sure that you, if you do use LastPass, save it as a new password, as a new entry. But if you also use Chrome and it likes to remember your passwords, don't let it remember your passwords in Chrome because it could overwrite what you've already got. So I'm just going to add a new item. And make a note of your username because it is different. So I've pasted my password in there. And then I'm going to go back in and get my Trailhead Playground username. So the username is JensyBeth at resourcefulwolf, blah, blah, blah. So copy that. Paste it into my username in LastPass, which it doesn't like me doing. I think my keyboard's running out of battery, actually. No, it does not like that. I've messed up. So right click, copy, paste. Make sure you keep your password. I'm going to call this Trailhead Playground for teaching. And save. And now I've got that together. So if I get stuck and I want to use it for the data loader, you know, I can do that. I know Kat is totally trustworthy. Everyone's totally trustworthy, but this is good. This is recorded. Okay, so now it means that I can log in using the data loader, and I'm just going to try and prove that. So if I hit insert, I then get invited to choose the environment I want to log into. So I can do it through a production sandbox or a production org or a sandbox org. So because this is a developer and a Trailhead Playground, we just use production. Click login. And then you'll just get invited to log in and put your password, username and password in. So back to LastPass. So Trailhead Playground for teaching, copy password, back into data loader, paste the password, click remember me, log in. Now it's going to send me a verification code, which is a temporary code that allows you to log in. And it will come to your email. Click verify, authorize access, and now you're in. So let me hit next. Now we're logged in, we've got a session. We can now click to insert and we can choose which objects to load data into. We choose our CSV file, map it and everything, or we can export. If I click export here, I want to export all my opportunities. I can give the file a name and say, and then browse and show my computer, show Salesforce where I want to store my extract. So I can store it as a download in my downloads folder. Click next. And then you can choose all the fields you want. You can even structure a query in here as well. You can say, I only want you to download opportunities where is one equals false or equals true. It can get a bit fiddly. I tend to be quite selective with this. If I do choose to add, it starts to build a SQL query underneath, which looks a lot like SQL. And if I do want to be selective, I'm generally very careful about it. Or what I do is just download everything and then filter out the stuff I don't need in Excel. You'll get into your own nuance and way of working that you prefer. If I'm exporting stuff, I notice how here are all like the fields that we've been creating as part of our Trailhead. They're all shown there. So the way that the fields are shown is it shows all the standard fields first, in alphabetical order, and then it shows all of your custom fields afterwards. So I'm just going to select everything, and I'm going to click finish, and it's going to ask me if I'm sure. I hit yes, and it extracts, and I can view what's been extracted here. This I actually find is a really useful way to figure out what the hell I need to do if I'm putting automations together. Where do I get the IDs? You know, and if I'm not sure whether a field needs to be an ID or a name, just export it through the data loader and have a look at the data that's there. Obviously, take steps afterwards to delete it when you don't need it anymore, because remember, it's storing it locally on your own machine. Just a few best practice tips. If you do export data, check, and you're doing it you're working on a client project, check your statement of work and your master services agreement to see what has been agreed about where data is to be stored and kept. Because if you like to use iCloud or you like to use Google Drive, there are some customers who will not want you putting their data onto your G Suite. Equally, make sure you have an encrypted laptop if possible. So if you, most laptops like Macs as well, you can choose to encrypt or non-encrypt the drive. Good practice, make sure you keep it encrypted, and try not to do this kind of stuff on the train. It's not just because of security reasons, but because also like the way that signal cuts in and out while you're on the train, you're going to make mistakes as it is, because you could be halfway through a job, lose your signal, and actually Salesforce doesn't go all or nothing when you're doing data loads. It will load by batch. So if let's say you've got a batch of 17,000 timesheets and your internet drops halfway through, which it did to me, I then had to go back and find see how far it had gone down the list by actually running a comparison between the success file that came out versus the input file to figure out how far down the line it had got, so I could cut my import file in half and then restart the data loader with the second half of that file. It was a nightmare. So you want to make sure that if you're doing very large volumes, use the bulk API because it's quicker, but also don't do it if you've got an unreliable internet connection. It can fall over. Oh, and also turn off your automations, especially if they email people. I think that will do for today. We've come to the end of time. Does anybody have any questions or comments before we go? Did you all enjoy today's session? Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for coming. I'll post the homework. I'll stay here for a little bit longer so I can post the recording and the homework up for you. And I will speak to you tomorrow, same time. Thank you, everybody.